George Jackson was born on the west side of Chicago on September 23, 1941, in poverty. Early in his life, he did what many poor children do. He began to steal. He was picked up from time to time by the police. Sometimes he was beaten. Sometimes he was thrown in a cell. He continued to steal. He ran with a neighborhood gang. He played truant. School had nothing to teach him, he said. His life was in the streets. In 1956, his father moved the Jackson family to California, hoping that the move would help to reform his son. It did not. In 1957, he was sent to Paso Robles for breaking into a department store and for possessing a stolen motorbike. By the time his 7 months were up, he was in open revolt. He took up guns. During the school week, he made bullets. During the weekends, he practiced shooting in the countryside around Bakersfield. In 1958, he was arrested on 3 charges of robbery. He escaped. He was picked up in his mother's hometown of Harrisburg, Illinois. He escaped again. A day later, he was found and badly beaten. He spent 15 months in Tracy. In 1960, after a series of jail terms and escapes, Jackson and a friend went to Mexico. On their way back to Los Angeles, high on booze and reds, they held up a string of gas stations. Finally, close to home, they held up one too many. For stealing $70 with a toy gun, Jackson, as a 3-time loser, was sentenced to 1 year to life, even though his lawyer had made a deal with the prosecution. He was 18 when he entered the California prison system. Soon he became a big man. In both Soledad and San Quentin, he organized a wolf pack and worked to take over as much as he could of the gambling, dope, booze, and food rackets. He ordered and took part in such stabbings and killings as were necessary, and he spent an increasing amount of time in the hole. He was turned down every time he was reviewed for parole. Gradually, his activities in prison took on a political coloration. He had always been interested in African freedom fighters, and now he began reading Fanon, Marx, and Lenin. He gave political classes to the Wolf Pack. Then, 3 black prisoners were cold-bloodedly shot down in Soledad exercise yard. After the guard who had shot them was exonerated by a grand jury, Jackson decided to avenge the 3 men, one of whom had been a close friend and comrade. On January 16, 1970, he beat and killed a young guard named John Mills. Almost immediately, his case and the case of the 2 men who had been falsely charged with him in an attempt to make them testify against him became a cause célèbre in leftist circles. California radicals believed that he had been railroaded, and he became for them a symbol of prison resistance, a symbol of the revolutionary spirit they had failed to preserve in themselves. On August 7, 1970, in default of a larger operation which had been called off at the last moment, George Jackson's slight 16-year-old brother Jonathan entered a courtroom in San Rafael, close by San Quentin prison, with a number of weapons hidden beneath a coat and in a bag. He freed 3 prisoners and took 5 hostages, including the assistant district attorney and the judge, and then he walked across the Civic Center parking lot to a waiting van. A few minutes later, after the 9 people had climbed into the van, shots rang out. Jonathan Jackson, the judge, and 2 of the prisoners were killed. The opening shots of this barrage were almost certainly fired by 2 sergeants of the Criminal Conspiracy Section who were there in anticipation of the larger operation. The rest were supplied by police and by a number of San Quentin guards who just happened to be returning at the time from shooting practice. Jackson soon afterward formed, as a field marshal in the Panthers, his August 7th movement, his People's Army, which trained in the Santa Cruz Mountains. But the plans laid by them for a second courthouse operation in October 1970, an ambush in January 1971, and a prisoner escape in February 1971 never came off. One of the 2 leaders was exposed as an agent and killed. The other was imprisoned for his part in a courtroom fight. Membership in the Army was increased to take in the Berkeley Panther Group and a number of young whites. They began to smuggle material into San Quentin. Then, just a year after his brother's death, George Jackson was visited in San Quentin by a young attorney named Stephen Bingham. Bingham took into the interview room with him a tape recorder and a briefcase, supplied to him at the last moment by a young white woman who had entered the prison under an assumed name. As Jackson was being returned to his cell, an attempt was made to kill him. The gun he had been supplied did not work. The guards had one that did. Jackson was to be killed with this gun, which would then be identified by the guards as the gun he had been smuggled. The other, unworkable gun would be removed. The attempt, however, was not successful. Jackson overpowered the guard with the gun and then proceeded to free his fellow prisoners in the adjustment center. 2 guards were killed almost immediately, then a third who arrived in the adjustment center to check on an escort. Finally, Jackson, realizing that he would never escape and that if he didn't leave, they might all be killed, ran out onto the front yard to his death. He died almost immediately with a bullet blasted through his brain.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.